Between 1940 and 1942, the North Atlantic became a graveyard without markers. Merchant ships vanished beneath cold, black water, often without warning, sometimes without survivors. German U-boats, low, gray, and nearly invisible, slipped through the shipping lanes with deliberate patience. They did not seek glory. They sought tonnage. And with each sinking, the arteries connecting North America to Britain grew weaker. To those watching from shore, the submarines appeared almost unbeatable. They struck at night, surfaced to attack, then vanished before escorts could respond. Their commanders operated with discipline and precision, exploiting darkness, weather, and the vastness of the ocean itself. For the crews of Allied convoys, the sea no longer felt like a passageway. It felt like a trap, one that could close at any moment without sound or signal. The irony was cruel. Britain possessed one of the world's most powerful navies, yet it was being strangled by vessels smaller than destroyers and cheaper than battleships. The Allies could build ships faster than ever before, but the rate of loss threatened to outpace construction. Every tanker sunk meant fewer aircraft in the air. Every freighter lost meant fewer tanks at the front. The war was being decided not by armies in motion, but by mathematics beneath the waves. Escorts fought back with what they had. Depth charges were dropped into empty water. Sonar contacts vanished as quickly as they appeared. Aircraft could protect convoys only part of the way, leaving vast air gaps where submarines hunted freely. Crews learned to live with constant tension, listening, watching, waiting, knowing that survival often depended on chance rather than skill. By late 1942, the realization hardened into fact. If the Atlantic could not be secured, nothing else would matter. Factories would slow, armies would starve of fuel and ammunition. The invasion of Europe would remain a plan trapped on paper. The Allies did not yet know how to defeat the silent hunters, but they understood, with growing clarity, that innovation was no longer optional. And as U-boats continued their patrols with confidence, far from the front lines, a quiet shift was beginning, one that would soon turn the ocean itself against. For German planners, the submarine was not merely a weapon, but a strategy. U-boats offered a way to bypass Britain's surface fleet and strike directly at its lifeline. Steel, grain, fuel, and machinery, all of it had to cross the Atlantic. If those ships could be sunk faster than they could be replaced, Britain would weaken without a single invasion. On paper, it was an elegant solution to an otherwise unwinnable naval contest. The shock came swiftly. Allied convoys began disappearing in patterns too regular to ignore. Ships were torpedoed at night, often without warning, their positions reported by submarines that seemed to materialize out of the darkness and dissolve just as easily. Survivors spoke of explosions that split hulls in seconds, of burning fuel on black water, of rescue that came too late or not at all. Losses mounted faster than explanations. The irony was profound. The Allies controlled the surface of the oceans, yet the decisive battles were happening beneath it. Detection was unreliable. Sonar contacts were fleeting. A submerged U-boat could hear its hunters long before it could be seen, slipping away into depth and silence. For all their industrial might, the Allies were often blind, striking at shadows while the real threat moved unseen. Convoy escorts were built for a different war. Destroyers were fast, but they were designed to fight ships, not ghosts. Depth charges were crude instruments, effective only if dropped close, and often wasted on empty water. Aircraft could help, but only within limited range. Between continents lay vast expanses where submarines hunted without interference, choosing when to strike and when to vanish. Beneath the waves, the crisis deepened. Each successful patrol reinforced German confidence and eroded Allied certainty. Shipyards worked relentlessly, yet the arithmetic was unforgiving. Sinkings threatened to outpace construction. The ocean itself seemed to favor the attacker, offering concealment, patience, and surprise. By the end of 1942, the truth could no longer be avoided. The Battle of the Atlantic was tilting toward disaster. Unless the Allies found a way to see, track, and destroy what lurked below, control of the sea and perhaps the war would slip quietly out of reach. Somewhere beyond the convoys, a solution was forming, still untested and not yet trusted. The shock did not come from a battle, but from a workshop. In the midst of mounting losses at sea, Allied engineers introduced a weapon unlike anything that had come before it. It was small, forward-firing, and inelegant in appearance, a clustered array of spigot mortars mounted on the bow of escort ships. They called it the Hedgehog. It did not explode on contact with water. It waited, and in that restraint lay its power. At first, belief in the new weapon was tentative at best. Naval officers were accustomed to depth charges, blunt instruments that relied on approximation and luck. The Hedgehog demanded precision. Its projectiles would only detonate if they struck a submarine's hull directly. Miss, and nothing happened at all. To many commanders, this seemed like a flaw rather than a feature. In a war already strained by uncertainty, few were eager to trust an unproven device. The irony was unmistakable. The Hedgehog looked crude, almost improvised, lacking the dramatic force of rolling depth charges that shook ships and seas alike. Yet this unconventional design addressed the very weakness that had plagued Allied escorts for years. Depth charges forced ships to lose sonar contact during an attack. The Hedgehog allowed escorts to maintain it, firing forward while keeping the enemy in sight. For the first time, hunters could strike without turning away. Early trials were tense and inconclusive. Some attacks produced nothing but silence. Others ended abruptly, with a sharp underwater crack that left no doubt. When the Hedgehog hit, it destroyed its target completely. There were no near misses, no damaged submarines limping away. Success was binary. Either the U-boat escaped, or it did not survive at all. The learning curve was steep, but the results were undeniable. As the weapon spread through the escort fleets, patterns began to change. U-boat commanders grew cautious. Attacks became shorter. Bolder moves gave way to evasion. Convoys, once stalked with confidence, now bristled with quiet threat. The balance beneath the waves was shifting, not through overwhelming force, but through accuracy and adaptation. The revelation came slowly, then all at once. The Atlantic was no longer a sanctuary for submarines. A weapon, once dismissed as experimental, was rewriting the rules of engagement. Among U-boat crews, confidence was not bravado, it was habit. By the early years of the Atlantic campaign, German submariners had learned to trust the sea and their own experience within it. Patrol after patrol returned with confirmed sinkings and minimal losses. The routine became familiar. Locate the convoy, strike under cover of darkness, disappear before retaliation arrived. For many crews, the ocean felt mastered, its dangers predictable, its rhythms understood. The shock for the Allies came in repetition. Ships were sunk with alarming regularity, often in waters supposedly under protection. Escorts arrived too late or searched in the wrong direction. Submarines surfaced to attack, then slipped away before sonar could be brought to bear. Reports from convoy commanders told the same story again and again: efficient attacks, brief contact, no decisive response. To those on the receiving end, the U-boat seemed untouchable. Inside the submarines, the irony was rarely considered. Crews joked about Allied depth charges exploding harmlessly in the distance. Many believed the enemy lacked the imagination to change the nature of the fight. Allied technology was dismissed as clumsy, reactive, and slow. The idea that escort ships could ever gain the upper hand beneath the waves seemed implausible. Confidence hardened into assumption, and assumption into doctrine. This attitude was reinforced by success. Each sinking confirmed what crews already believed, that skill, patience, and concealment were enough. The Atlantic rewarded restraint and punished haste. U-boat commanders prided themselves on discipline, on knowing when to strike and when to vanish. Few saw reason to fear innovation from an enemy that appeared always one step behind. Yet on the other side of the ocean, frustration was producing something more dangerous than fear. Allied losses forced reflection. Failures were dissected. New ideas once dismissed as impractical or unnecessary were reconsidered. Escort tactics were rewritten. Detection methods refined. Weapons tested, discarded, and tested again. Progress was uneven, but it was persistent. The revelation, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single moment of realization, no announcement that the tide had turned. Instead, U-boat crews began to notice subtle changes. Attacks took longer. Escapes grew narrower. Sonar contact was held when it should have been lost. A depth charge pattern felt closer than expected. Confidence, once effortless, now required reassurance. In underestimating their enemy, The submariners had misread the nature of industrial war. Adaptation was not a weakness, it was a weapon. The Allies were learning. The shock was not in its power, but in its method. Mounted on the bow of Allied escort ships, the Hedgehog launched a tight pattern of small, forward-firing projectiles, arcing briefly through the air before plunging into the sea ahead of the ship. Unlike traditional depth charges, they did not detonate on a timer. They waited for contact. In that waiting, they denied submarines the space and time they relied upon to evade attack. For U-boat crews, the danger was invisible. There was no warning tremor, no distant explosion to signal an attack had begun. A submarine might believe it had slipped beyond pursuit, only to be struck moments later by a weapon it had never detected. Survivors would later describe the shock not as confusion, but as disbelief. The ocean had always given them room to maneuver. Now, suddenly, it did not. The irony lay in the weapon's appearance. The Hedgehog lacked the violence and spectacle of depth charges rolling off a ship's stern. Its projectiles were small, its mechanism inelegant. To observers, it seemed almost improvised. Yet this simplicity addressed a fatal flaw in earlier tactics. Escorts no longer had to lose sonar contact to attack. They could aim, fire, and listen, all at once turning pursuit into precision. The struggle to perfect the weapon continued even as it entered service. Crews trained relentlessly, learning new firing angles, new approaches, new ways to coordinate sonar operators and gunnery teams. Not every attack succeeded. Misses were frequent, and failures were unmistakable. But with each engagement, confidence grew not in luck, but in process. The Allies were no longer reacting. They were shaping the encounter. Then came the moment that changed perception. A Hedgehog salvo found its mark. There was no prolonged chase, no second attempt. One clean strike ended the engagement entirely. The submarine did not resurface. There were no evasive maneuvers, no survivors. The silence that followed carried a different meaning. It was confirmation. The revelation spread quickly through the escort fleets. The Hedgehog was not merely another tool, it was leverage. It shifted the balance from endurance to accuracy, from guessing to knowing. U-boats that once relied on patience and concealment now faced a weapon that punished hesitation and rewarded detection. What had begun as an experiment had become a promise. The Allies had found a way to fight beneath the waves on equal terms. And as word of successful attacks filtered through the Atlantic, U-boat commanders were about to learn that the sea they trusted was no longer neutral. For years, U-boat crews believed in the sanctuary of depth. Below the surface, beyond the reach of guns and aircraft, they felt insulated from consequence. The ocean concealed them, absorbed sound, blurred intention. Dive deep enough, remain still long enough, and danger would pass overhead. This belief was not reckless, it was earned through experience. Again and again, submarines had escaped destruction simply by slipping beneath the waves. The shock came not with warning, but with absence. No rolling explosions, no scattered depth charges detonating behind them. Instead, there was silence, followed by sudden impact. The Hedgehog did not announce itself. It did not churn the water or telegraph its approach. It struck forward, precisely, exploiting the brief moments when a submarine believed it was safe. For crews accustomed to hearing danger before feeling it, the change was disorienting and fatal. The irony was inescapable. The very tactic that had ensured survival diving deep and waiting now worked against them. The Hedgehog thrived on predictability. A submerged submarine maintaining course and depth became a fixed problem rather than a moving one. The ocean, once a shield, became a boundary. There was no room to maneuver, no warning to evade. Depth no longer meant distance from threat. U-boat crews attempted to adapt. Some changed patrol patterns. Others stayed surfaced longer, gambling on speed instead of concealment. Maneuvers became more aggressive, escapes more desperate. But adaptation requires time, and time was the one resource no longer available. The Hedgehog reduced engagements from prolonged hunts to sudden conclusions. There were fewer second chances, fewer narrow escapes, fewer stories of survival. The struggle was psychological as much as tactical. Confidence eroded quietly. Sonar pings carried new weight. Escorts behaved differently, calmer, more deliberate. They did not rush. They did not scatter explosives blindly. They waited, listened, and struck once, The balance of fear began to reverse. It was no longer the convoy that felt hunted. The revelation unfolded across the Atlantic in reports and silences. Submarines failed to return. Patrol zones once considered safe grew empty. Commanders realized that something fundamental had shifted, though few fully understood how. A weapon once dismissed as improbable had altered the equation of underwater warfare. The Hedgehog did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone, but it broke an assumption that had protected the U-boats since the war's beginning, that depth guaranteed survival. That belief, once unshakable, was gone. And with it vanished the certainty that the ocean would always belong. By the middle years of the war, desperation had become a constant companion for Allied commanders in the Atlantic. Convoys still sailed, and escorts still fought, but losses continued to arrive on paper with numbing regularity. Each sunken ship represented more than steel and cargo. It meant delayed factories, grounded aircraft, idle divisions waiting for fuel and ammunition that might never come. The war was being won on land and lost at sea, and the contradiction could not last forever. What made the situation more troubling was the realization that traditional answers had reached their limits. Escort numbers increased, patrols expanded, and training improved, yet the results remained uneven. Depth charges were refined, sonar upgraded, tactics revised, but the fundamental imbalance persisted. The U-boats still chose when to attack and when to disappear. The Allies were improving, but they were still reacting to an enemy that controlled the tempo beneath the waves. The irony was difficult to ignore. The Allies possessed overwhelming industrial power, yet they struggled to neutralize a weapon that relied on concealment rather than strength. More ships did not guarantee fewer losses. More explosives did not ensure success. The ocean absorbed mistakes and concealed failure. It was becoming clear that the solution would not come from doing the same things better, but from doing something different altogether. Under this pressure, the Hedgehog began to move from experiment to necessity. Its early deployments were cautious, even tentative. Crews trained while under threat, learning a new rhythm of detection and attack. Results were mixed. Some engagements ended without effect. Others produced sudden, unmistakable success. The weapon did not offer certainty, but it offered possibility, and in a campaign defined by attrition, possibility mattered. With each patrol, a subtle shift occurred. Escorts began to behave differently. They held sonar contact longer. They attacked with restraint rather than urgency. The absence of explosions no longer meant failure. It meant patience. Crews learned to trust silence, to wait for confirmation rather than reassurance. Confidence did not arrive suddenly, but it grew steadily, reinforced by results that could not be explained away. As successful engagements accumulated, the effect spread beyond individual ships. Convoys began to feel less vulnerable. Loss rates declined, unevenly at first, then more consistently. U-boat commanders reported increasing difficulty approaching targets undetected. Attacks required greater risk, closer proximity, longer exposure. What had once been routine was becoming hazardous. The revelation was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The Allies had discovered that innovation could compress time and space in their favor. The Hedgehog shortened engagements, reduced uncertainty, and punished predictability. It rewarded coordination and discipline rather than chance. For the first time, escorts possessed a weapon that aligned with their growing understanding of underwater warfare. This did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, but it altered its direction. Desperation gave way to momentum. Losses no longer defined the campaign alone. Progress did. The Allies had not stumbled upon victory. They had engineered it, piece by piece, under relentless pressure. And as the Atlantic slowly began to tilt away from, the shock arrived not as a single event, but as a pattern. Reports began to surface of U-boats destroyed with an efficiency previously unseen. Engagements that once dragged on for hours were ending in minutes. Escorts that had long returned empty-handed now reported confirmed kills. The Hedgehog, tested cautiously and doubted quietly, was producing results that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. With each confirmed sinking, a belief quietly dissolved. U-boats had ruled the Atlantic through fear, patience, and invisibility. They had been predators in an environment that favored concealment over confrontation. Now, for the first time, they faced the real possibility of destruction the moment they were detected. The balance that had protected them, depth, silence, and time, was eroding. Survival was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. The irony was sharp and uncomfortable. For months, even years, the Allies had hesitated to fully embrace the Hedgehog. Concerns over training, reliability, and doctrine had slowed its deployment. In hindsight, that caution appeared costly. Every delayed installation represented convoys lost under old rules, battles fought with outdated assumptions. Once the weapon proved itself, hesitation vanished. Production accelerated. Escorts were refitted. Doctrine changed with urgency rather than debate. The struggle shifted immediately beneath the waves. U-boats were forced into a new kind of combat, one defined not by evasion, but by exposure. To attack, they had to close distance. To escape, they had to maneuver under sustained detection. The Hedgehog punished both choices. Staying deep invited precision strikes. Attempting escape increased noise and vulnerability. The submarine, once a master of patience, was now trapped by its own limitations. For U-boat crews, the experience was disorienting. Escorts no longer broke contact to attack. There was no predictable pattern to exploit, no reassuring sequence of distant explosions followed by silence. Instead, there was focus. Escorts pressed forward, held sonar lock, and fired once. If the Hedgehog missed, the silence continued. If it hit, the engagement ended. The margin for error collapsed. As these encounters multiplied, the revelation became unavoidable. The Allies were no longer merely defending convoys. They were controlling the fight. Loss rates began to tilt decisively. Submarines returned less frequently. Patrol zones thinned. German commanders noted rising casualties and declining effectiveness, yet struggled to counter a weapon that required no radical exposure from the attacker. The ocean was no longer neutral ground. The Atlantic did not change overnight, but its character shifted. Where U-boats once hunted with confidence, they now moved with caution. Where escorts once reacted, they now anticipated. The Hedgehog did not win through brute force, but through alignment matching detection, decision, and destruction into a single action. By the time this transformation was fully recognized, the advantage had already changed hands. The Allies now held a weapon that did. By the time the shift became undeniable, it had already been underway for months. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, still possessed lethal capability, still sank ships when opportunity allowed. But the rhythm of the hunt had changed. Submarines were no longer the unseen observers dictating tempo. Increasingly, they were being tracked, pursued, and cornered. For crews accustomed to patience and control, the sensation was unfamiliar and unsettling. What defined this new struggle was not weakness, but exposure. U-boats now found themselves hunted in a manner they had not anticipated. Escorts no longer scattered blindly or abandoned contact to attack. They pressed forward with restraint, holding sonar lock, waiting for certainty. Engagements shortened, escapes narrowed. Where submarines once faded into the depths, they now felt the ocean closing in around them. The irony was stark. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun as a contest overwhelmingly in Germany's favor. A small force of submarines had threatened the survival of entire nations. For years, the imbalance seemed permanent, almost structural. And yet, without a dramatic announcement or decisive fleet action, that advantage began to dissolve. The same sea that once protected the hunter now betrayed it. U-boat commanders adapted as best they could. Patrol zones shifted. Attack methods changed. Greater caution replaced boldness. But every adjustment carried a cost. Staying submerged longer reduced speed and awareness. Surfacing invited detection. Silence limited communication. Each choice narrowed the margin for success. The submarine, once flexible and elusive, became constrained by the very tactics that had once guaranteed survival. For the Allies, the transformation was equally profound. Convoy escorts operated with growing confidence, not because the threat had vanished, but because it had become measurable. Detection led to engagement. Engagement led to resolution. Losses no longer defined every report. Ships arrived more reliably. Schedules stabilized. The Atlantic began to function again as a corridor rather than a battlefield. At the heart of this shift lay a simple but decisive change: certainty. The Hedgehog did not overwhelm the ocean with explosions. It clarified the moment of attack. It collapsed the space between detection and destruction. In doing so, it denied the U-boat its greatest defense time. Submarines that once relied on patience now faced a weapon that punished hesitation. The revelation: when it was finally acknowledged, reshaped strategic thinking. The Battle of the Atlantic was not being won by numbers alone, nor by attrition in its traditional sense. It was being won by alignment technology matched to understanding, weapons designed to exploit behavior rather than brute force. The Hedgehog did not replace escorts or aircraft, it completed them. This did not mean the U-boat menace ended overnight. Submarines continued to fight, and losses continued on both sides. But the psychological balance had shifted irreversibly. Fear no longer flowed in one direction. The predator had become vulnerable. The hunted had learned how to hunt. By the time Allied planners began to think seriously about operations, the shock arrived in fragments, signals cut short, patrols that failed to report, gaps where submarines were expected to return. Then the pattern emerged. A U-boat group entered the Atlantic with confidence and experience, operating under assumptions shaped by years of success. Within days, several were gone, not damaged, not driven off, simply erased. For the first time in the campaign, loss could not be explained away as misfortune or coincidence. What unsettled German commanders most was not the scale of destruction, but its character. There were no prolonged chases, no drawn-out exchanges that allowed skill or endurance to tip the balance. Engagements ended abruptly. Escorts held contact, advanced steadily, and fired once. Silence followed. The ocean, which had always given warning before punishment, now offered neither. The irony cut deeply. The U-boats had built their identity around stealth, patience, and control. They believed themselves masters of an environment that favored concealment over confrontation. Yet now, those same qualities betrayed them. Remaining submerged no longer ensured survival. Stillness invited precision. The tactics that had once preserved life now fixed position and sealed fate. This realization did not arrive all at once. At first, it was resisted. Crews blamed chance, unusual conditions, or isolated failures. But as reports accumulated, denial became impossible. Submarines were being found and destroyed in circumstances that should have allowed escape. The sea was no longer neutral. It had been measured, mapped, and disciplined by an enemy that had learned how to listen. The turning point was not a single battle, but a shift in behavior. U-boat commanders grew cautious. Attacks were aborted. Patrols shortened. Risk calculations changed. The confidence that once defined submarine warfare gave way to hesitation. And in that hesitation, opportunity passed to the Allies. Escorts pressed their advantage, not with aggression, but with certainty. The Hedgehog had altered the logic of combat beneath the waves. It collapsed the distance between detection and destruction. It punished predictability and rewarded restraint. For the first time, Allied escorts did not need to guess. They did not need to overwhelm the ocean with force. They needed only to know, and once they knew, the outcome was swift. The revelation for German command was stark and unavoidable. The balance of power in the North Atlantic had shifted. Submarine losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. Experienced crews were gone, taking with them instincts honed over years of patrol. New crews entered a war that no longer resembled the one their predecessors had mastered. For the Allies, the change was equally profound. Convoys moved with growing assurance. Losses, while still painful, no longer defined the campaign. The Atlantic began to function as a system again, predictable, schedulable, reliable. Supplies flowed, fuel arrived. Planning extended beyond survival toward strategy. The U-boat menace did not vanish overnight. Submarines continued to fight, and some continued to succeed. But the era of dominance was over. Fear no longer traveled in one direction. The hunter now had to consider escape before attack. The hunted had learned how to strike back. In that moment, quiet, incremental, and irreversible, the war at sea changed character. What had begun as a contest of invisibility for German naval command, belief in adaptation had always been central to submarine warfare. The U-boat arm itself was born from innovation, from the idea that speed, stealth, and coordination could offset numerical inferiority. Faced with rising losses, German planners assumed the same logic would apply again. If the Allies had introduced a new weapon, it could be studied, countered, and ultimately neutralized. The ocean, after all, had always rewarded those who learned fastest. Orders followed quickly. Crews were instructed to vary depth more aggressively, to alter approach angles, to abandon predictable evasion patterns. New tactical guidance emphasized speed after contact, and caution before attack. Some commanders were encouraged to remain surfaced longer, trusting night and weather to compensate for increased exposure. Others were told to disengage at the first sign of detection. These measures reflected urgency, but also uncertainty. The shock was that none of it worked as intended. Losses continued, not dramatically, but steadily. Submarines that followed revised doctrine still failed to return. Escorts maintained contact where they once lost it. Engagements ended before countermeasures could matter. Reports from surviving crews described attacks that felt unavoidable, as if the enemy knew not only where the submarine was, but what it would do next. What made the situation worse was the irony at its core. The very characteristics that had defined the U-boat's strength, submergence, patience, concealment, had become liabilities. Deeper dives reduced speed and awareness. Longer silence, limited coordination, efforts to remain unseen fixed submarines into patterns that the enemy now understood. Adaptation, once the submarine's greatest advantage, was constrained by physics and endurance. German engineers explored technical solutions, but time was not on their side. New detection countermeasures offered marginal improvement at best. Training replacements took months. The war no longer afforded. Experienced crews were irreplaceable, and they were disappearing. Each lost submarine carried with it years of institutional knowledge that no redesign could restore. The turning point came quietly, through decisions rather than declarations. Patrol areas were reduced. Risk thresholds tightened. Submarines were withdrawn from sectors once considered essential. The Atlantic, once a proving ground for German naval ambition, became a zone of caution. Presence gave way to preservation. The goal was no longer dominance, but survival. For the Allies, this retreat was unmistakable. Convoy routes stabilized. Escorts encountered fewer attacks, and when they did, the encounters favored preparation over surprise. The absence of submarines spoke as clearly as their presence once had. A threat that had defined the war at sea was losing coherence. The revelation extended beyond tactics. It exposed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Innovation did not favor those who struck first, but those who adapted most completely. The Allies had not merely introduced a new weapon, they had integrated it into doctrine, training, and behavior. The Hedgehog was effective because it matched understanding with execution. For Germany, the limits of adaptation had been reached. The submarine arm had reshaped naval warfare once. Now, it was being reshaped by it. The Atlantic no longer rewarded concealment alone. It demanded precision, coordination, and systems that worked together rather than in isolation. By the time this reality was fully acknowledged, the balance had already shifted. The U-boats had not been defeated the shock revealed itself not in headlines, but in numbers. Month after month, German submarines failed to return at a rate that could no longer be concealed by optimism or explanation. Losses mounted faster than replacements could be built, trained, and deployed. Crews disappeared into the Atlantic with growing frequency, and the silence they left behind carried strategic weight. What had once been a war of endurance was becoming a war of attrition Germany could not survive. The irony was unmistakable. The U-boat arm had been conceived as Germany's answer to naval inferiority, a precise instrument designed to collapse Allied supply lines without confronting superior fleets. For years, it had done exactly that. Yet the very weapon that once threatened Britain's survival now stood diminished, overstretched, and increasingly ineffective. The backbone of German naval strategy had become a liability it could no longer sustain. The turning point did not arrive with a single decision, but through accumulation. The Hedgehog, combined with improved sonar, radar, air cover, and coordinated convoy tactics, closed the gaps that submarines once exploited. Escorts no longer fought blind. Aircraft extended protection deep into the Atlantic. Detection led to engagement, and engagement increasingly led to destruction. The margin that once allowed U-boats to escape shrank until it vanished altogether. German command faced an impossible equation. Continuing the campaign meant accepting losses that crippled morale and depleted experienced crews. Withdrawing meant conceding the Atlantic and surrendering any realistic hope of strangling Allied logistics. Attempts to introduce new submarine designs and countermeasures arrived too late, burdened by shortages and Allied bombing. Innovation, once Germany's advantage, had been overtaken by Allied scale and coordination. As the campaign waned, the Atlantic itself seemed to change character. Convoys crossed with fewer interruptions. Escorts grew confident in routine rather than vigilance alone. Shipyards shifted focus from replacement to expansion. What had been a desperate fight for survival became a managed system of movement and supply. The ocean was no longer a battlefield defined by fear, but a corridor of momentum. The revelation lay not in the defeat of the submarine as a weapon, but in the defeat of the assumptions behind it. Stealth alone was no longer decisive. Isolation no longer guaranteed safety. The Allies had learned to integrate intelligence, technology, and discipline into a single response. The Hedgehog symbolized this shift not as a miracle weapon, but as proof that understanding an enemy's behavior could be more powerful than overwhelming force. For Germany, the withdrawal from the U-boat campaign marked the end of a strategic era. The Atlantic could no longer be contested on favorable terms. Resources were redirected, expectations lowered. The silent hunters, once feared across the seas, faded into the background of a war now decided elsewhere. For the Allies, the end of the U-boat threat unlocked something far greater than safety at sea. It enabled planning on a continental scale. Fuel, men, and machines moved with reliability. The foundations were laid for operations that would soon reshape Europe itself. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with celebration, but with quiet certainty. Innovation, persistence, and adaptation had prevailed. The ocean had been mastered not by dominance, but by learning. And with the U-boat threat broken, the path forward, once fragile and uncertain, now lay open, waiting for the next phase of the war to begin. The consequence unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly. As U-boats vanished from the Atlantic, the arteries of war began to pulse with new consistency. Cargo ships crossed oceans with fewer interruptions. Fuel arrived where it was needed, when it was needed. Factories no longer waited on delayed shipments. Armies no longer planned around scarcity. The destruction of the submarine threat did not announce itself with a single moment of triumph, but with the steady restoration of movement, the quiet return of reliability. For the Axis, the loss cut deep. The U-boat arm had been more than a tactical weapon. It had been a strategic hope. It offered a way to contest Allied power without matching it ship for ship or fleet for fleet. When that hope collapsed, so too did the prospect of isolating Britain or delaying American strength. The Atlantic ceased to be a pressure point and became instead a conduit for Allied momentum. The irony lay in how this turning point unfolded. There were no decisive fleet engagements, no dramatic last stands broadcast across the world. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won in spectacle, but in repetition, in patrol after patrol where nothing happened, in convoys that arrived intact, in submarines that did not return. Victory took the form of absence, not presence. At the center of this quiet transformation stood a weapon that few civilians ever knew by name. The Hedgehog did not dominate headlines or inspire parades. It did not overwhelm the sea with force. It simply worked consistently, efficiently, and in alignment with a deeper understanding of underwater warfare. Its effectiveness was measured not in explosions witnessed, but in threats removed. The revelation was subtle but profound. The Allies had won a war beneath the waves without most of the world realizing it was being fought. Soldiers trained, airfields expanded, and invasion plans matured, all made possible by a victory already secured far from view. The success of future campaigns rested on an assumption so basic it was rarely questioned: that supplies would arrive. That assumption had been earned in silence. This victory reshaped the nature of the conflict. With the Atlantic secured, the scale of Allied operations expanded beyond survival toward decision. Resources flowed with confidence. Timidable held. The war's center of gravity shifted away from uncertainty and toward execution. What had once been a fragile lifeline became an instrument of inevitability. For Germany, the absence of U-boats carried its own meaning. The loss was not merely material, but conceptual. The idea that stealth alone could offset industrial disadvantage had been disproven. Adaptation, once delayed, had arrived too late. The submarine had not failed as a weapon. It had failed as a solution to a changing war. The men who served beneath the waves on both sides rarely saw the larger picture. They experienced the conflict as tension, routine, fear, and fatigue. Yet their actions shaped outcomes far beyond their immediate horizons. The Atlantic campaign did not produce iconic images, but it produced something more enduring: freedom of movement, History would later focus on beaches and cities, on battles fought in daylight and memory. But beneath those moments lay a quieter truth. The war was decided not only by those who advanced, but by those who ensured advancement was possible. The ocean, once hostile and unforgiving, had been brought into order through patience, learning, and restraint. The silent victory was complete not when the last submarine was sunk, but when the Atlantic stopped being a question, when it no longer demanded attention. Behind every technical breakthrough stood men whose names rarely appeared in communiques or headlines. Engineers, draftsmen, test crews, and junior officers worked in workshops and training waters far from the Atlantic's violence. Their labor was methodical, often frustrating, and carried out under the weight of urgent expectation. They did not witness convoys arriving safely, nor submarines failing to return. They saw measurements, malfunctions, and revisions, small increments of progress that only later revealed their full consequence. For those involved in the Hedgehog's development, the experience was defined by uncertainty. Early tests produced as many questions as answers. Calculations had to account for motion, water density, sonar accuracy, crew coordination. Failure was frequent and instructive. Each misfire or ineffective salvo forced reassessment. The weapon did not emerge fully formed. It was shaped by persistence rather than inspiration. Innovation, in this sense, was less a moment than a process of refusal to accept the limits imposed by previous doctrine. The irony was that once the weapon proved decisive, its success rendered it almost invisible. Sailors trusted it. Commanders integrated it. Convoys moved on. There were no ceremonies for the alignment of detection and destruction. No public acknowledgement of how close the Atlantic had come to failure. The Hedgehog became part of routine, a quiet assurance rather than a celebrated achievement. Outside naval circles, few understood what had changed, or why. For the men who built and refined it, recognition was secondary. Many understood that the true measure of success lay in absence in ships that did not sink, in engagements that ended quickly, in routes that remained open. Yet there was also a private reckoning. The same calculations that saved convoys also ensured submarines did not survive. Innovation, when successful, left little room for ambiguity. It clarified outcomes as much as it prevented disaster. This clarity carried a human cost. Each confirmed kill represented lives lost beneath the waves, often unseen, unrecorded, and unresolved. Engineers were not insulated from this reality. Some reflected on the paradox of creation used for destruction, of precision employed to end rather than preserve. The Hedgehog was not designed to wound or deter. It was designed to decide. That decisiveness weighed differently on those who understood it most intimately. The revelation that followed was neither triumphant nor regretful, but sober. Warfare did not reward ingenuity with gratitude. It absorbed it. Innovations were judged solely by whether they worked, not by the care or conscience that shaped them. Yet history moved according to those hidden decisions. The Battle of the Atlantic turned not because of spectacle, but because someone questioned an assumption and refused to accept its cost. In the years after the war, accounts of naval victory focused on fleets and campaigns, on admirals and admirations. The Hedgehog appeared as a footnote, if at all, but its influence endured in doctrine and design, in the understanding that modern conflict is decided as much by integration as by force. Innovation mattered not when it was introduced, but when it was trusted. For the men behind the weapon, this understanding was enough. They had not sought recognition. They had sought resolution. For a time, the U-boats ruled the waves not through dominance of the surface, but through mastery of what lay beneath it. They turned the Atlantic into a realm of uncertainty, where silence concealed danger and absence signaled loss. Convoys crossed under constant tension. Escorts searched without certainty, and entire strategies bent around the fear of interruption. It was a reign defined not by conquest, but by denial of movement, of security, of time. That reign endured because it exploited a gap in understanding. The Allies could see the ocean, patrol it, and defend it above water. Below the surface, however, they fought a different war, one where detection lagged behind decision and response trailed opportunity. For years, the submarine thrived in that space. Depth offered safety. Patience offered survival. The U-boat did not need to win decisively. It needed only to persist. The Hedgehog changed that equation by asking a different question. Instead of overwhelming the ocean, it sought to clarify it. It aligned detection with action, and action with consequence. It did not rely on chance or spectacle. It demanded accuracy, discipline, and trust in process. In doing so, it transformed underwater warfare from a contest of endurance into one of resolution. The deployment of the Hedgehog did not announce itself as an ending. There were no declarations, no sudden collapses. What followed instead was a narrowing of options, of margins, of escape routes. U-boats still sailed, still attacked, still inflicted loss, but they did so under new constraints, in an environment that no longer favored concealment alone. Each patrol carried greater risk. Each engagement offered fewer second chances. This shift carried moral weight as much as strategic consequence. The Hedgehog did not merely counter a weapon. It countered an assumption that invisibility ensured safety, that patience would always outlast pursuit. By breaking that assumption, the Allies reclaimed agency beneath the waves. They learned not just how to survive the Atlantic, but how to master it. The end of the U-boat menace came quietly. Convoys arrived more often than they were attacked. Losses declined without ceremony. The ocean resumed its role as passage rather than barrier. What had once been a desperate fight for continuity became a foundation for planning, for movement, for decision. The war expanded outward because one critical space had been secured inward. In retrospect, the absence of drama is its own testament. The Atlantic did not explode into peace. It stabilized. And in that stability lay victory. The Hedgehog did not win through overwhelming force, but through understanding of physics, of behavior, of fear. It taught the Allies how to fight beneath the surface rather than against it. The moral closure of the campaign is found not in triumph, but in transformation. The U-boats ruled the waves until the Allies learned to fight beneath them. Once that lesson was learned, dominance gave way to decline, not because the submarines were flawed, but because warfare had evolved beyond them. History often remembers the battles it can see,